The Georgian dissident self-publishing history began in the 70s of the last century. Under the communist regime, it took on to reveal all the problems related to the national ideology, history and the culture of Georgia, education, the protection of the human rights, the protection of the Georgian church, and the cultural monuments. It was these publications that brought to light the criminal activities of the Soviet totalitarianism. Disclosure began in the 70s when the self-published papers gradually clearly portrayed the prevailing criminal situation in all spheres of the state. The available materials in the archives of the citizens and in the state institutions fell into the hands of the individuals who were able to gain the trust of the population through self-sacrifice for the homeland and selfless life. Every day of their lives was associated with the greatest risk, but the longing for freedom was so strong that no amount of pressure, no blackmail, no unbridled campaign could repress their goals. The prevailing lawlessness, immorality, the covering up of the crime, falsity further strengthened fears against the existing regime. The communist monster, thanks to this fear, prolonged its existence. The suppression of the fear in the people could only be done with the truth. The dissident self-publications have taken over to tell the truth. Initially, information was spread about the existing violation in the sphere of the human rights protection, about the encroachment of the cultural monuments, and about the established crimes in the entrails of the Georgian church, about the prevailing classification in the educational system and institutions, forbidden church holidays, about the existing censorship in the sphere of science and culture. The difficult task of finding and publishing of existing materials was carrying out some members of the initiative group of the Human Rights Protection, Zviad Gamsakhurdia, Merab Kostava, Manana Archvadze Gamsakhurdia, Leda Archvadze, Temur Janelidze, Isai and Gregory Goldstein's Samkharadze. The chief credo of the initiative group was, "We must live for the idea and not for the earthly welfare. We must make sacrifice. We mustn't betray our lofty belief, even if we have to face to death. This will be a practical confirmation of our understanding of the highest duty. This will give the meaning to our existence." Zviad Gamsakhurdia. The communist ideology and its underlying consumer weakened young people's attention, tempted and offered positions, carefree life, abroad trips, encouraging arrangements, therefore made them to lose interest and spirituality, civil bravery to the politics. Since the 70s, shadowing, interrogations, summonses, threats have intensified from the side of the KGB. Since this period, communion has begun with the hard destiny, which is called the dissident life. It is full with the daily troubles, persecution, blackmail, which gives you a strong stimulus of fight. You feel the power of the truth. You try to do as much as possible to save the homeland and the people. Since 1972, the Georgian Human Rights Protection Group has been associating with the Russian dissident circles, with Moscow and Leningrad self-publications. Since the same year, it has been collaborating with academician Andrei Sakharov, Safarovich Chalidze, Sergei Kovalyov, Alexander and Arina Ginsburgs, Laut Gaster Tverdakhlebov, Borisov, Velikanov, Alexeyev, Amalrak, etc. In Tbilisi, self-publication is printed and distributed. Solzhenitsyn's The Boulders from Below, Current News Chronicle, The Peace and Violence, Sakharov's The Fight for Peace, a collection of Sakharov's articles, Solzhenitsyn's article Live Without Lies, Letters to the Leaders, Solzhenitsyn's A Calf Was Batting Under an Oak, Solzhenitsyn's Letter to the Leaders of the USSR, The USA and the USSR in a boat, Roy Medvedev's For the Court of History, Solzhenitsyn's collections of articles, What Awaits the Soviet Union, Konstantin Gamsakhurdia's The Friendship of Enemies, Konstantin Gamsakhurdia's The Way of Life, Words and Deeds of the Soviet Military, to Grigol Rubakidze's 19th anniversary, the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the KGB used torture methods, Zviad Gamsakhurdia's article, The Polemic with the Western Press about the state of the Georgian Church, Zviad Gamsakhurdia's A Letter to the Editorial Staff, Zviad Gamsakhurdia's document, Public Problems, the Interrogation Protocols of Teimuraz Djashishvili. The year 1974 is an important date in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's creations. This year, in the Western states, the Gulag Archipelago was published, which stunned the whole world. The leaders of the totalitarian state proved the complete feebleness in the spiritual struggle for the truth and goodness, which led to the expulsion of the writer from his homeland. Despite the cruel sentence handed down to the author, Zviad Gamsakhurdia and Merab Kostava carried out the hardest and the most dangerous mission. They decided to publish the Gulag Archipelago in Georgia and then spread on the territory of the USSR. All stages of the preparation of the edition were associated with the greatest difficulties. The above-mentioned anti-Soviet literature, the list is incomplete, was printed in Tbilisi on Gali Street number 19 and on Vakhtang Chikovani Street number 28. In the workshop, everyone refused to do such a labor-consuming and dangerous job. So, two self-published representatives, Manana Archvadze Gamsakhurdia and Leda Archvadze, had to do the labor-consuming work before putting it in a book cover. We worked day and night to deliver thousands of copies of the book to the readers of Georgia and Russia on time, which Alexander Ginsburg hadn't handed over only one copy to Zviad Gamsakhurdia due to the lack of the book. The distribution of the book caused a great stir in the Kremlin and in the security services throughout the USSR. Taking out it from Georgia was equal to death, but Zviad and Merab were not afraid of it. Part of the books were inserted in the cover, part were unbound. This case laid the groundwork for the massive spreading of the self-publication in the USSR. In the indictment of Zviad Gamsakhurdia and Merab Kostava, we can read, Gamsakhurdia aimed at mass spreading of anti-Soviet literature. Since 1974, he actively has engaged in attracting specialists, the polygraphic and the printing equipments, who had a great money compensation. We can read in the indictment of case number 131, Gamsakhurdia aimed at mass spreading of anti-Soviet literature. In the spring of 1974, he got all 4 parts of Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago of that author who was expelled from the USSR for his hostile activities. The Gulag Archipelago was published in Paris in Umka Press, which condemns Marxist-Leninist doctrine of the socialist revolution. What was the reason of the passivity of the Ministry of the Internal Affairs and the KGB? At the time in Georgia there was politically explosive situation. Shevardnadze's repressive politics have provoked various forms of protest in Georgia. Massive explosions and fires, the danger of the universal unrest of the population was created. Factories and government buildings were being exploding. All this was an elemental form of the protest. At this time, the dissident movement was gathering strength. Shevardnadze could not dare to attack openly because he knew that a living classic of Georgian literature, Konstantin Gamsakhurdia, had been by this moment the most popular writer in Georgia. That's why the KGB delayed the arrest of Zviad Gamsakhurdia and Merab Kostava. The second hindering factor, Solzhenitsyn's book's confiscation. The arrest of Zviad Gamsakhurdia and Merab Kostava for the multiplication and distribution of the book would attract the attention of the world society, Solzhenitsyn himself too, toward Georgia, which would put Moscow in an extremely unprofitable position. In parallel with the multiplication and the distribution of self-publications, the Georgian dissident movement was strengthening its position internationally. In April 1975 in Moscow, the Amnesty International was formed by Turin and Tverdokhlevo, where Zviad Gamsakhurdia was elected to represent Georgia. In 1976 in Moscow, the Helsinki Executive Contact Group was formed by academician Arlov. The same year in June in Georgia, Zviad Gamsakhurdia creates the similar group, the main purpose of which is to collect information and articles on the human rights issues, which was published in the Georgian self-publishing magazine Sakartvelos Moambe. At the same time, groups in Moscow and Georgia are making collective statements on human rights violations. The dissident movement is entering a new phase of struggle. In 1975-76 in Georgia, a magazine, Okros Satsmisi, The Golden Fleece, is printed and distributed in mass circulation. 4 numbers, Sakartvelos Moambe 2 numbers. The technical side of publishing that magazines was provided by Manana Archvadze Gamsakhurdia and Leda Archvadze. In May 1975, the literary political magazine The Golden Fleece was published, in which works were printed banned by the KGB and the communist censorship. The Friendship of Enemies of Konstantin Gamsakhurdia, The Issues of the History of Georgia in the 19th Century of Ivan Javakhishvili, Articles and Poetries of Merab Kostava, the article materials, the articles, speeches of Konstantin Gamsakhurdia, which were banned by the censorship. He condemns the Sovietization of Georgia and demands the independence of Georgia. In the same magazine, works of Bob Ghiashvili, Maisuradze, Chantladze, Samadashvili, Gruzinsky, and others were printed, as well as works of the classics of Georgian literature, Vaja Pshavela, Agagi Tsereteli, famous Georgian writers, Irodio Nevdoshvili, Lado Asatiani, and others. Authors were sometimes printed under a pseudonym. The magazine Sakartvelos Moambe was of a political nature. The annotation of the magazine informs us. It is typical for the Soviet totalitarian system to cover up unfavorable information for the authorities in all spheres, administrative, political, as well as public life. The magazine Sakartvelos Moambe aims to provide the Georgian population with the information on national, religious, and social issues, as well as general situation created in the USSR. The first number of Sakartvelos Moambe begins with the UN Declaration of Human Rights Protection, which was signed by the USSR authorities. The issue of teaching Georgian history in Georgian schools and higher educational systems, on the attempt of Russification, the condition of the Georgian Orthodox Church, the protection of the cultural monuments in Georgia, the torture of prisoners in Georgian prisons, the creation of the first torture building in Georgia by Shevardnadze, fires and sabotages in Georgia, the shooting of the political prisoner Zhvania, the robbery of the Georgian Patriarchate, in which the members of the Central Committee are disclosed, officials, the Ministry of the Internal Affairs, employees of the KGB, the members of their family, the commissioners for religious affairs and their staff, clergy, etc. In the next number of Sakartvelos Moambe, some KGB agents from the Red Intelligentsia have been disclosed, which caused great indignation in the press, began attacks on Zviad Gamsakhurdia and Merab Kostava. The authors of the article openly demanded their arrest. Professor Gordeziani, Quachachia, Surguladze, Khavtasitsi. From March 1977, the accusations against Merab and Zviad came out like hail. Traitor, agent of imperialism, grabber, traitor Pharisee, etc. In Soviet history, for the first time, the official press opposed self-publications, which intensified people's interest in magazines. People were interested in everything about dissidents. Even newspapers that cursed undeservedly Zviad and Merab and slandered them sold secretly in the newspaper booths at a pretty decent price. Despite the unbridled campaign of the mass media, students and the intelligentsia could not hide their indignation. On April 2, 1977, workers of the newspaper Akhalgazda Komunisti threw this number as a sign of solidarity. They did not follow the order of the Central Committee of Georgia, and instead of a critical article, the white page was handed over to the Central Committee. Quotation from one of the Pasquas: "Traitors, you cannot call them otherwise. A handful of people led by Zviad Gamsakhurdia who try to harm everything which is obtained by blood and horny hands. During the festive march, you have no right to support the people you are against." The words of Leonid Brezhnev were also reminded. Opponents of socialism, against of agents of imperialism, will take appropriate action which is provided by our legislation. According to Brezhnev's statement, the only goal was proved. The arrest of Zviad and Merab was inevitable. April 1st, 1977, the meeting of the Presidium of the Writers' Union, chaired by Grigol Abashidze. At the time, Grigol Abashidze was the chairman of the Writers' Union, the KGB communist gendarme. The Presidium of the Writers' Union acted as the General Prosecutor's Office. In order to present himself before the Central Committee, everyone tried to oppose Zviad Gamsakhurdia maximally. In his final speech, he admitted that he was the self-publishing editor, but he pleaded not guilty. Noteworthy is Merab Kostava's position, who asked Zviad to be named co-editor to alleviate the situation, but Zviad did not agree with Merab. Merab and I were following Zviad's trial in the Writers' Union. Since we were not allowed to attend it, we were standing in the corridor. The Presidium of the Writers' Union was the first to pass sentence. Zviad Gamsakhurdia was expelled unanimously from the ranks of the Writers' Union of the USSR. His action was condemned and declared inappropriate for a Soviet writer. See the stenograph of the April 1st, 1977 meeting of the Writers' Union and the stenograph of the extended meeting of the Scientific Council of the Institute of Literature. A few days later, on April 5th, at the institute named after Shota Rustaveli of the History of Georgian Literature of the Georgian Academy of Science, where Zviad worked, another trial was held. The only issue raised at the extended meeting of the Scientific Council of the Institute, the condemnation on unworthy activity of Zviad Gamsakhurdia and Irakli Kenchashvili. Irakli Kenchashvili was Zviad Gamsakhurdia's employee, who at the time was interested in the fate of his imprisoned brother Lery Kenchashvili. He handed over several statements to Zviad. Their originals were sent to the Central Committee and to the editorial offices of several newspapers. His interests were apolitical, related to a family problem. The meeting was chaired by the director of the institute, academician Alexandre Baramidze. Everything was going according to the scenario of the Central Committee of Georgia. Zviad Gamsakhurdia was convicted of activities unacceptable to a Soviet scientist, publication of illegal magazines, and anti-Soviet propaganda. The majority of the participants of the meeting condemned Zviad's patriotism and noted that the confession of guilt was needed. Standing on the way of socialist construction, refusal of the critique of the Soviet patriotism socialist system. In the resolution of the Extended Scientific Council of the Institute, Zviad Gamsakhurdia's anti-Soviet slanderous action was unanimously condemned. On the 7th of April 1977, Zviad Gamsakhurdia and Merab Kostava were arrested in Tbilisi. Case number 131 was preceded. The first part of Article 71 of the Civil Code of the Georgian SSR, anti-Soviet agitation propaganda. The case, which consisted of 56 volumes, began on the 7th of April 1977 and ended on the 7th of March 1978. The search materials, the fingerprints, the photos, and the identification protocols against them. Immediately after their arrest, the KGBists began raiding families for searching without the prosecutor's sanction. The search was carried out simultaneously on Merab Kostava's apartment in Javakhishvili Street number 1 and in Gali Street number 19 in the Kolkhian Tower, where more than 100 high-ranking officials roamed the entire area like locusts, from the building to the yard. The search on my sister Leda Archvadi's apartment on Vakhtang Chikovani Street number 28 lasted for 2 weeks. The KGB's tough control obviously was difficult. Everyone had banned entering the family. 2 young women with 10-month-old Sotni Gamsakhurdia were under the terrible psychological and physical pressure. The KGB operated freely. In addition to materials of direct interest to them, Konstantin Gamsakhurdia's manuscripts and items were taken out from the families, which we could not return. The biggest machine of disinformation and slander was set, which was spread from Tbilisi to Moscow, Leningrad, Vilnius, Omsk, Frunze, Donetsk, and other cities. After the arrest of Zviad Gamsakhurdia and Merab Kostava, the self-publication did not stop. A newsletter was published, of which I was the compiler and the editor, along with several like-minded people. The prisoners were under the great pressure, because of which they resorted an extreme form of protest, the hunger strike. The hunger strike lasted 4 months. Zviad and Merab used their right of silence. They refused to testify. During the long hunger strike, the KGB resorted to violent feeding of prisoners. They used the artificial method of feeding, which was carried out by supervisors in addition to doctors. It was necessary to take an extreme step which for decades the security services of the USSR had mastered quite well. It was the placement of the rebellious prisoners in a psychiatric hospital. Merab Kostava was placed in the psychiatric department of the Ortajala prison. In August 1977, Zviad was transferred to Moscow, to Lefontov named prison of the KGB, and then to the Serbsky psychiatric clinic. At the same time, in Honolulu, a conference of psychiatrists was held, where the greatest attention was paid to the purest method in Soviet psychiatry, torture of prisoners in psychiatric hospital. This method of torture was unanimously condemned at the conference. The USSR was expelled from the World Psychiatric Association. The French psychiatrists showed special activity towards Zviad and Merab. Thanks to our diaspora, the prisoners were released from the psychiatric torture within a few months. In December 1977, a commission composed of Soviet psychiatrists recognized Zviad Gamsakhurdia and Merab Kostava as mentally healthy. In 1977, about 40 members of the Helsinki Treaty Executive Group were arrested. In the USSR, U.S. congressmen, for the purpose of physical survival, have nominated prisoners for the Nobel Prize, among them Zviad Gamsakhurdia and Merab Kostava. The leadership of the USSR solved this problem perfectly. The Nobel Prize laureate became Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Egypt, who signed the Treaty of Camp David. On May 18, 1978 was held a trial. The session was chaired by Kobakhidze, the judges Grigolia Narimanidze, the prosecutor Ugulava, the treasury defenders Alkhazishvili, Nikolaishvili. The court sentenced Merab and Zviad 3 years in a strict regime and 2 years in exile. Zviad with the family was in Nogai Steppe, Hamlet Kochube, and Merab in Perm. The KGB and its agents have been trying for years to confront Merab and Zviad as if Zviad had shown weakness and repented. But the attempt to declare as the repentance of this fact was in vain. Anyone who listened to it on TV or read the repentance published in the newspaper Komunisti, everyone understood what the spreader of rumors division of KGB served, and so-called politicians aggravated by national ideas. Merab Kostava said, "He who is against Zviad is against me," which he attached a verse to the Christian brother, and Zviad in response dedicated a poem to the martyred brother. Many tried to create a rift in my and Zviad's friendship, but no one could do it. It would never happen, but if a miracle happened and a rift arose in our friendship, then I will say the friendship does not exist at all, and this is already equal to the demolition of the country, wrote Merab Kostava on the 31st of March in 1989. Time has proved the firmness and wideness of Zviad and Merab's friendship, and the eternity of true values. The truth voiced by dissident self-publications awaked and changed Georgia. The Georgian nation has changed for the better, prepared for important battles, without which freedom cannot be achieved. Manana Zviad Gamsakhurdia.